Marcus, we have to go. Forget him. Let's go.
I said you're under arrest.
The call crackled through the dispatch radio at 2:14 p.m. on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in Rochester, New York. A potential anaphylactic shock. Male, mid-40s, bee sting. The location was Exchange Boulevard, right in the heart of the city, where midday traffic was a snarl of delivery trucks, office workers on late lunch breaks, and tourists. For Lekia Smith, a paramedic with 12 years on the job, the location was the first problem. The second was the word anaphylaxis. It was a race against a closing airway, a biological clock that ticked in seconds, not minutes. Her partner, a steady hand named Marcus Cole, navigated the ambulance with practiced skill, sirens clearing a path that seemed to close up the moment they passed. Lekia had been a Marine combat corpsman before she became a paramedic. She'd treated blast injuries in Fallujah with nothing but a headlamp and the adrenaline-fueled focus that chaos demanded. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to see only the mission, the patient. She was 38 years old, had seen the worst the city could offer, and had earned a reputation for being unflappable. They arrived on the scene at 2:19 p.m., a 5-minute response time that felt like an eternity. Marcus pulled the ambulance halfway onto the curb, positioning it to both protect the scene and allow for a quick departure. It blocked a single lane of traffic, an unavoidable necessity. Lekia was out the door before the vehicle had fully stopped, medical bag in hand. A small crowd had gathered around a man lying on the sidewalk, his face swollen and red, his gasps for air audible from 10 feet away. "He was just walking to his car," a woman said, her voice trembling. "A bee got him on the neck." Lekia dropped to her knees. "Ma'am, I need everyone to step back. Give us room to work." The man was conscious, but barely. His skin was covered in hives, his lips already showing a bluish tint. Cyanosis. His airway was closing. Lekia's hands moved with an economy born of 1,000 similar calls. "Marcus, get the EpiPen and an IV kit. I need O2, now!" She tore open the man's collar, assessing the sting site. Her mind was a checklist of protocols. Epinephrine first to open the airway and counteract the allergic reaction, then an IV for fluids and antihistamines, then rapid transport. She administered the injection into the man's thigh, a practiced, firm motion. As Marcus prepared the oxygen mask, she heard the sharp, commanding tone of a voice she instantly recognized. Not a fellow first responder, but law enforcement. "You need to move this vehicle. It's blocking traffic." Lekia didn't look up. Her patient's breathing was still dangerously shallow. "This is a critical medical emergency. The vehicle stays where it is until we transport." "I'm not asking, I'm telling you. Move the ambulance, now!" The voice was closer now, laced with an impatience that grated on Lekia's nerves. She glanced up, her eyes meeting those of a young police officer. He couldn't have been more than 30. His name tag read Miller. His posture was rigid, his hand resting on the grip of his Glock in a way that was meant to convey authority. His jaw was set, a clear sign he was accustomed to immediate compliance. "Officer," Lekia said, her voice calm but unwavering, her hands never ceasing their work on the patient. "This man is in anaphylactic shock. His airway is closing. He could be dead in the next 3 minutes. Moving the ambulance is not the priority right now. My priority is keeping him alive." "Your priority is to follow a lawful order," Officer Miller retorted, taking another step forward until his shadow fell over her and the dying man. "I have traffic backing up for 3 blocks. Move the rig, or I'll move it for you." Marcus, who had just fitted the oxygen mask over the patient's face, straightened up. "Officer, with all due respect, she's right. This is a life-or-death situation. We need to stabilize him and transport immediately. The ambulance is positioned for safety and rapid egress." Miller ignored Marcus. His focus was entirely on Lekia, the woman who had dared to defy him. It was a clash of duties, a collision of worlds. For Lekia, the highest authority was the Hippocratic Oath, the sacred duty to preserve life. For Officer Miller, the highest authority was the badge on his chest, and the power it represented. "I need to see your license and certification," Miller demanded. Lekia felt a surge of disbelief, so profound it was almost comical. "They're in the ambulance," she said, her voice tight. "Right now my hands are busy trying to stop this man from dying. You can check my credentials through your dispatch. They can verify I work for Rochester EMS. Now please, step back and let me do my job." The patient let out a weak, gurgling sound. His oxygen saturation levels were dropping. The epinephrine was helping, but not fast enough. Her words hung in the humid air, a direct challenge to Officer Miller's authority. His face, already flushed from the heat, darkened with anger. He saw a paramedic defying a police officer. Lekia saw a man in a uniform who was about to get her patient killed. The crowd of onlookers was silent, their phones held up like digital witnesses to the unfolding drama. "You're making a big mistake," Miller said, his voice low and menacing. "The only mistake being made here is your interference," Lekia shot back. "Marcus, let's move. On 3. 1, 2... Before she could say 3, Miller acted. He lunged forward, not toward the stretcher, but toward her. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're done," he snarled. "You're under arrest." The world seemed to slow down. The distant sound of traffic, the murmurs of the crowd, the strained breathing of her patient, it all faded into a dull roar. Under arrest? For what? The charge was nonsensical, a fiction created out of thin air by an officer whose pride had been wounded. She looked from his hand on her arm to his face, a mask of grim determination. He was committed. He was going to see this through, no matter the cost. "Let go of me," Lekia said, her voice dangerously quiet. "If you arrest me, you are sentencing that man to death. Is your ego worth a man's life?" "You should have complied," Miller said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "This is on you. Turn around." Marcus was frozen for a heartbeat, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What are you doing? You can't be serious!" he yelled, finally finding his voice. Miller ignored him. He yanked on Lekia's arm, trying to spin her around. She stood her ground, her feet planted, a lifetime of discipline and service refusing to yield. She would not be cuffed. She would not abandon her patient. "I am a paramedic performing my duty," she said, pulling her arm free with a surge of strength. She immediately turned her attention back to the man on the stretcher. His condition was worsening. "Marcus, we have to go. Forget him. Let's go." It was a gamble. She was betting that even Miller wouldn't physically stop them from loading a dying man into an ambulance. She was wrong. As she and Marcus finally lifted the stretcher, Miller grabbed her again, this time with more force. He spun her around, her medical bag slipping from her shoulder and crashing to the ground, its contents spilling across the sidewalk. "I said you're under arrest! Obstruction of governmental administration and resisting arrest!" he shouted, the official language sounding absurd in the context of the life-and-death struggle happening beside them. He forced her arms behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into her wrists. The sharp metallic click seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the street. It was the sound of a line being irrevocably crossed. It was a sound being recorded by at least a dozen smartphones. "My patient!" Lekia pleaded, her professional composure finally breaking. "Marcus, take care of my patient!" Marcus, his face pale with fury and fear, gave a jerky nod. He was alone now. He quickly began chest compressions as the patient's breathing stopped entirely. He was in cardiac arrest. The delay, the stress, the interruption of care, it had pushed him over the edge. "Somebody call 911 again," Marcus shouted to the crowd. "Tell them a paramedic has been arrested on scene and I need immediate backup." Officer Miller began marching Lekia toward his patrol car, a grim parade of one. She could hear the shouts from the crowd now, a chorus of outrage. "What are you doing to her? She was trying to save him. We're all recording this, you idiot!" Miller shoved her into the back of his car, the plastic seat hot and unyielding. The door slammed shut, sealing her in a cage of metal and plexiglass. Through the rear window, she watched Marcus working desperately on the man she had been forced to abandon. She saw a bystander, a woman in a business suit, kneel down and begin giving rescue breaths, following Marcus's shouted instructions. The community, the very people Miller was supposed to protect, were stepping in to do the job he had prevented Lekia from doing. She sat in the suffocating heat of the patrol car, the handcuffs cutting into her skin, and felt a cold, clear certainty settle over her. Officer Miller thought he had won. He thought he had asserted his authority and put a defiant woman in her place. He had no idea what he had just done. He hadn't just arrested a paramedic, he had created a witness out of every person on that street. He had recorded his own misconduct on his body camera, and he had just started a war with a woman who had been trained never to surrender. The 10-minute drive to the Monroe County Public Safety Building was made in suffocating silence. Officer Miller refused to look at her, his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He was either replaying the events in his head, trying to construct a narrative where he was the hero, or he was beginning to feel the first cold prickle of fear. Lekia hoped it was the latter. She used the time to breathe, to push down the anger and humiliation and bring her training to the forefront. Assess, adapt, overcome. This was just a new kind of battlefield. When they arrived at the Sally Port, Miller walked her inside with a grip on her arm that was entirely for show. The central booking area was a drab, institutional space, smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. The moment they entered, heads turned. Cops knew paramedics. They were partners in the chaotic dance of emergency services. They saw each other at car wrecks, overdoses, and domestic disputes. Seeing a paramedic in handcuffs, escorted by a fellow officer, was an anomaly that immediately set off alarm bells. A grizzled sergeant with tired eyes and a salt-and-pepper mustache looked up from his desk. "Miller, what in God's name is this?" "Arrested for obstruction and resisting, Sarge," Miller announced, his voice a little too loud, a little too defensive. The sergeant, a man named Patterson, looked past Miller at Lekia. He recognized her. "That's Lekia Smith. She's one of the best medics in the city. What the hell happened?" She refused to follow a lawful order to move her ambulance at a scene. It was blocking traffic, Miller recited as if reading from a script. Patterson's gaze narrowed. He looked at Lekia's uniform, then back at Miller. The story didn't add up. "She was on a call, wasn't she?" "She was interfering with my scene," Miller insisted. The lie was so blatant, so self-serving, that Lekia had to fight the urge to laugh. His scene? It was her scene. It was a medical emergency long before he had arrived to secure it. The booking process was a methodical stripping away of dignity. Her fingerprints were taken, her photograph captured under harsh fluorescent lights. Her personal effects were inventoried and sealed in a plastic bag. Her wallet, her keys, and her phone, which now contained several missed calls and a string of frantic text messages from Marcus and her supervisor. The booking officer, a young woman who looked barely old enough to be in uniform, handled Lekia's paramedic certification with a look of quiet confusion. The credentials in her hand were a stark contradiction to the woman in handcuffs standing before her. "Do you have any injuries?" the officer asked, her tone gentle, almost apologetic. "My patient might," Lekia replied, her voice steady. "He went into cardiac arrest after Officer Miller prevented me from treating him." The officer's pen froze. She looked up, first at Lekia, then over at Miller, who was leaning against a wall trying to look nonchalant. The young officer's expression hardened. She made a note on the form. Lekia was led to a small concrete holding cell. The heavy steel door slammed shut, the sound echoing the finality of the handcuffs clicking into place. She sat on the cold metal bench and finally allowed the full weight of the situation to wash over her. It wasn't just the arrest, it was the public humiliation, the violation of her duty, the gnawing uncertainty about the fate of her patient. She had been in the cell for less than 30 minutes when a figure appeared on the other side of the bars. It wasn't a police officer, it was a woman in a sharply tailored dark blue suit, carrying a leather briefcase. She looked to be in her late 40s with an air of intelligence and no-nonsense energy that was palpable even through the steel bars. "Lekia Smith?" the woman asked. Lekia stood up. "Yes. My name is Evelyn Reed. I'm an attorney. Your union representative called me as soon as he got the report from your partner. He said you might need some help." Relief, sharp and sudden, flooded through Lekia. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Reed said, pulling a legal pad and a pen from her briefcase. "I've already spoken to your partner, Marcus. I have his version of events. Now I need yours. Tell me everything. From the moment the call came in, don't leave out a single detail." Lekia recounted the entire incident, her voice calm and precise as she detailed the patient's condition, Miller's arrival, his escalating demands, her repeated attempts to explain the medical necessity of her actions, and the final, violent arrest. Reed listened intently, her pen flying across the page. She asked pointed questions. "Did he ever ask about the patient's condition?" "No, only about moving the ambulance." "Did he identify what crime you were supposedly committing before he arrested you for obstruction?" "No, he just kept demanding my ID." "Did he read you your rights?" "No." Reed clicked her pen shut and looked Lekia straight in the eye. "This arrest is garbage. It's a textbook case of unlawful detention and a clear violation of your civil rights. He interfered with emergency medical services, which is illegal. We're going to get you out of here, and then we're going to make them pay." The lawyer's confidence was a lifeline. For the first time since the handcuffs had closed around her wrists, Lekia felt like she wasn't alone. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Evelyn Reed was as good as her word. Less than an hour after their meeting, Lekia was released on her own recognizance. The charges of obstruction and resisting arrest were still technically pending, but Reed assured her they wouldn't stand up to even the slightest scrutiny from the district attorney's office. "They'll be dropped by the end of the week," she said with confidence as they stood on the steps of the public safety building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Marcus was waiting for her across the street, leaning against their ambulance. He rushed over the moment he saw her, his face etched with worry. "Lekia, are you okay?" "I'll live," she said, managing a weak smile. "What about our patient? What happened?" Marcus's expression turned grim. "It was bad, really bad. The backup ambulance got there about 6 minutes after you were taken. We got his pulse back on scene, but he coded again on the way to Strong Memorial. He's in the ICU now. The doctor said the delay in definitive care, it caused hypoxic brain injury. They don't know if he'll wake up." The words hit Lekia like a physical blow. Hypoxic brain injury, lack of oxygen to the brain, all because of a few minutes, a few crucial minutes stolen by an officer's ego. The man, whose name she later learned was Robert Davis, a 46-year-old father of 2, might never be the same. The weight of that reality was heavier than any jail cell. Over the next few days, as predicted, the DA's office formally dropped all charges against Lekia. But for her, that wasn't justice. It was merely the correction of a mistake. Justice would be holding Officer Miller and the system that enabled him accountable. She met with Evelyn Reed in her downtown office, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Genesee River. Reed laid out the options. They could file a complaint with the police department's Internal Affairs Division, a process Reed warned was often slow and biased in favor of the officer. Or they could take a more aggressive route. "We file a federal civil rights lawsuit," Reed said, her tone leaving no doubt as to her preferred course of action. "We sue Officer Kyle Miller individually and the city of Rochester for failing to train and supervise its officers. We allege unlawful arrest, violation of your First and Fourth Amendment rights, and intentional interference with medical services." "It's not about money for me," Lekia said firmly. "I want to make sure this never happens to another paramedic. I want him off the street." "I understand," Reed said, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. "And that's why we go the federal route. A lawsuit gets their attention in a way an internal complaint never will. It forces them to answer for their actions in a public forum, under oath. And frankly, The financial penalty is the only language a city government truly understands. It's how we force change. The decision was easy. "Let's do it," Lekia said. The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later. Lekia Smith versus Officer Kyle Miller and the City of Rochester. The complaint was a meticulously documented 30-page narrative of the incident, citing state laws, medical protocols, and constitutional precedents. It included sworn affidavits from Marcus and 3 of the bystanders who had recorded the arrest on their phones. The city's initial response was telling. Their legal department contacted Evelyn Reed within a week, not to contest the facts, but to feel out a settlement. "They're testing us," Reed explained to Lekia over the phone. "They know the optics are terrible. They offered $25,000 to make this go away." Lekia let out a short, bitter laugh. "$25,000? Is that what my career, my dignity, and Mr. Davis's brain function are worth to them?" "It's an insult," Reed agreed. "It's what they call nuisance value. They're hoping you're just looking for a quick payday and will be intimidated by the prospect of a long legal battle." "Tell them no," Lekia said without hesitation. "Tell them it's not enough, not even close." "That's exactly what I told them," Reed replied, a smile evident in her voice. "I told them our next conversation would be about scheduling depositions. Now the real work begins. We're going into discovery. We're going to get Miller's personnel file, the dispatch logs, the internal affairs reports, and most importantly, his body camera footage." The city's dismissive offer had been a strategic error. They assumed Lekia Smith was an ordinary citizen who would be easily placated. They had failed to understand that they weren't dealing with a victim. They were dealing with a fighter, a woman who had been trained to run toward the crisis, not away from it. And now, the crisis was them. They had underestimated her resolve, and they were about to find out how costly that mistake would be. The discovery phase of a lawsuit is a slow, methodical grind, a war fought with motions, requests for documents, and legal maneuvering. For 4 months, Evelyn Reed's office buried the City of Rochester's legal department in paperwork. They requested every complaint ever filed against Officer Miller, his training records, his performance evaluations, and every use of force report he had ever written. The city pushed back, claiming privacy concerns and privileged information, but Reed was relentless, filing motions to compel and winning them one by one. A picture of Officer Miller began to emerge from the documents. In his 6 years on the force, he had accumulated 18 citizen complaints, ranging from verbal abuse to excessive force. Not a single one had resulted in disciplinary action beyond a verbal warning. He was an officer who operated on the edge, protected by a system that was institutionally predisposed to defend its own. But the true prize, the piece of evidence that would change the entire trajectory of the case, was the body camera footage. The city tried to withhold it, citing an ongoing internal investigation. Reed took them before a federal magistrate judge who, after hearing the arguments, ordered the footage be turned over immediately, his irritation with the city's stonewalling tactics barely concealed. The video file arrived at Reed's office on a password-protected thumb drive. Lekia sat with her lawyer in a small conference room as Reed clicked open the file. The screen flickered to life, and Lekia was transported back to that hot Tuesday on Exchange Boulevard. The footage began with Miller in his patrol car, the dispatch call audible in the background. The video was shaky as he got out of the car and approached the scene. The first thing it captured was Miller's perspective, not the dying patient on the ground, but the ambulance blocking a lane of traffic. His focus was immediately on the vehicle, a problem to be solved, an obstacle to his sense of order. The audio was crystal clear. It captured his first command to move the vehicle. It captured Lekia's calm, professional response, explaining the critical nature of the emergency. It captured her voice, again and again, trying to de-escalate, trying to make him understand that a human life was at stake. "This man is in anaphylactic shock. His airway is closing," her voice said from off-camera. "I need you to move this ambulance," Miller's voice replied, cutting her off. The camera's lens then turned toward Lekia as she worked, showing her hands moving quickly, professionally, over the patient. It showed the patient's swollen face, his labored breathing. To any reasonable person, it was undeniably a life-threatening situation. But the camera also showed that Miller never once looked at the patient for more than a fleeting second. His gaze, his attention, his entire focus was on Lekia, the source of his frustration. The most damning part was the escalation. The footage showed Miller stepping into her personal space, his body language becoming more aggressive. It recorded his demand for her ID and her explanation that she couldn't stop treatment to retrieve it. It recorded Marcus Cole trying to intervene, his voice pleading and reasonable. Then came the arrest. The camera shook violently as Miller lunged forward and grabbed Lekia. The audio captured her shocked cry, Marcus's shout of protest, and Miller's furious declaration, "You're under arrest! Obstruction and resisting!" The sound of the handcuffs clicking was sickeningly loud. But the camera kept rolling. It captured the aftermath. It showed Marcus, now alone, starting chest compressions on the patient who had just gone into cardiac arrest. It captured the faces in the crowd, their expressions of horror and outrage. It recorded their voices shouting at Miller, a cacophony of condemnation. The footage continued as Miller marched Lekia to his car, shoved her in the back, and slammed the door. He had, in effect, documented his own crime. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Lekia stared at the blank screen, her hands clenched into fists. Seeing it from his perspective, hearing the cold indifference in his voice as she begged him to consider her patient, was more infuriating than the memory itself. Evelyn Reed slowly turned away from the screen. She had a grim, satisfied look on her face. "Well," she said softly, "that's the ball game." "He never even looked at the patient," Lekia whispered, the realization hitting her with fresh force. "No, he didn't," Reed confirmed. "He saw a challenge to his authority and nothing else mattered. A jury will see that. The city's lawyers will see that. This video isn't just a piece of evidence, Lekia. It's a confession. And he has no idea he even made it." The body camera, a tool intended to promote police accountability, had done exactly that. It had provided an unimpeachable witness, an objective eye that saw past the uniform and the badge and revealed the truth of what happened. The city's case had just evaporated. With the body camera footage in their possession, Evelyn Reed's strategy shifted from offense to a methodical execution. She sent a copy to the city's legal department with a simple 3-word email. "Let's talk settlement." The response was immediate. The city's tone, once dismissive, was now bordering on frantic. They wanted to avoid a trial at all costs. They knew what a jury would see in that footage. A police officer, sworn to protect and serve, actively preventing a paramedic from saving a life. They proposed mediation, a formal negotiation process overseen by a neutral third party. Reed agreed, but on one condition. Officer Miller's deposition would go forward as scheduled. "We need his version of events on the record, under oath," Reed explained to Lekia. "We need to lock him into his story before we talk numbers. It will give us maximum leverage." The deposition took place in a sterile conference room at a neutral law firm. Officer Kyle Miller arrived flanked by his police union lawyer and an attorney from the city. He wore a crisp suit, a stark contrast to the uniform he'd worn on the day of the arrest. He looked confident, almost arrogant, as if this were just a procedural hurdle to be cleared. Evelyn Reed began the questioning calmly, almost conversationally. She had him walk through his training, his understanding of the law, and his duties as a police officer. Then she turned to the events of that Tuesday. "Officer Miller, when you arrived on Exchange Boulevard, what was your initial assessment of the situation?" she asked. "It was a chaotic scene," Miller replied, his voice steady. "An ambulance was illegally parked, blocking a major thoroughfare during rush hour, creating a public safety hazard." "Did you observe the individual on the ground?" Reed asked. "I observed a group of people and 2 paramedics." "Did you observe the medical condition of the man on the ground?" "I am not a trained medical professional," Miller said evasively. "My job was to secure the scene and restore the flow of traffic." Reed paused, letting his answer hang in the air. So, your primary concern was the flow of traffic, not the potential for a medical fatality? The union lawyer objected, but Reed simply rephrased the question. Officer Miller, did paramedic Lakia Smith inform you that the patient was in critical condition? She said something to that effect, yes. Did she tell you the man's airway was closing and that he could die within minutes? She was uncooperative and agitated, Miller deflected. That's not what I asked, Reed pressed, her voice hardening slightly. Did she, a trained paramedic, warn you of an imminent life-threatening emergency? Yes or no? Miller shifted in his seat. Yes. And after she gave you this information, your response was to demand she stop treating the patient and move the ambulance. Is that correct? My response was to have her comply with a lawful order. For 6 hours, Reed led him through the incident, minute by minute, her questions precise and relentless. She used his own police report against him, pointing out inconsistencies. She used the bystander videos to contradict his claims. He insisted Lakia was the aggressor. He claimed she had been yelling and acting erratically. He painted himself as the calm professional trying to restore order. Then, Reed had the body camera footage played on a large screen in the conference room. The confident, composed Officer Miller began to shrink in his chair. The video showed a reality completely at odds with the story he had just told under oath. It showed Lakia's calm, firm voice. It showed his aggression, his singular focus on the ambulance. It showed him initiating physical contact. It showed him ignoring the dying patient. Reed stopped the video just after the handcuffs clicked. Officer Miller, she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire proceeding. You just testified under oath that Ms. Smith was agitated and that you were trying to de-escalate the situation. Does this video support your testimony? Silence. The union lawyer whispered something in his ear. Does it, officer? Reed repeated. The video shows one perspective, Miller mumbled. It shows your perspective, does it not? This is the footage from the camera on your chest, and it shows you arresting a paramedic while her patient goes into cardiac arrest a few feet away. Is that your understanding of securing the scene? The deposition ended shortly after that. Miller's confident facade had crumbled, replaced by a sullen, defensive posture. He had been caught in a lie that was now permanently enshrined in a sworn transcript. The city's attorney called Evelyn Reed the next morning. The desire to talk settlement was now an urgent plea. The initial insulting offer of $25,000 was a distant memory. The new offer started at $350,000. Lakia and Reed discussed it in her office. It's a significant number, Reed acknowledged, but it's not their final number. And more importantly, it comes with no admission of wrongdoing and no promise of policy changes. Lakia looked out the window at the city she served. She thought of Robert Davis, who had recently been moved to a long-term care facility, able to breathe on his own but still unresponsive. She thought of other paramedics who might face a similar situation, who might not have a dozen witnesses with cell phones. No, Lakia said firmly. This was never just about the money. We demand two things in addition to the financial settlement. First, the Rochester Police Department has to rewrite its protocols for interacting with on-scene medical personnel. Mandatory training, with real consequences for violations. Second, Kyle Miller is to be terminated from the police force, immediately. Reed raised an eyebrow. Those are big demands, Lakia. They'll fight us on the termination. Then we go to trial, Lakia said, her voice unwavering. Let a jury watch that video and decide if he deserves to wear a badge. Those are my terms. No compromise. The city's lawyers balked at Lakia's demands, just as Evelyn Reed predicted. A financial settlement was one thing. It could be paid by insurance carriers and buried in the city budget. But firing a police officer and mandating sweeping policy changes was a public admission of systemic failure. The police union would fight the termination tooth and nail, and the department's leadership was resistant to any changes that appeared to diminish officer authority. They're refusing to discuss the termination, Reed told Lakia a week later. They're offering more money instead. They've come up to $500,000. My terms haven't changed, Leckia said. I didn't think they would, Reed said. So I filed a motion for summary judgment and attached the deposition transcript and the body camera footage. I also sent a copy to the lead reporter at the Democrat and Chronicle. The legal and public pressure began to mount. The newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Paramedic arrested while saving life. Body cam footage raises questions." The article detailed the incident and quoted heavily from the lawsuit. Public outrage was swift and vocal. City council members were inundated with calls. Activist groups organized a protest outside the public safety building. The narrative the city had tried so desperately to control was now being written by the media and the public, and it was not in their favor. The final negotiation session took place not in a lawyer's office, but in the chambers of the federal judge assigned to the case. He had reviewed the evidence and made it clear to the city's attorneys in a private meeting that their position was untenable. "You're going to lose this at trial," he told them bluntly, "and the jury award will be exponentially higher than any settlement you're contemplating now. Settle this case. Today." Faced with a losing legal battle, a public relations nightmare, and pressure from the judge, the city finally folded. The final settlement was for $750,000. It was a substantial sum, a clear acknowledgement of the damages Leckia had suffered. But the real victory was in the other terms of the agreement, the ones Leckia had refused to compromise on. The Rochester Police Department agreed to a complete overhaul of its protocols regarding interactions with EMS and fire personnel at emergency scenes. The new policy, which Leckia and Reed had a hand in drafting, was explicit. Active, life-saving medical treatment was to be the highest priority. Police officers were forbidden from interfering with patient care for administrative reasons, such as moving a vehicle or securing identification. Any dispute on a scene between law enforcement and medical personnel would require the immediate response of a police supervisor. Furthermore, every officer on the force, from rookie to chief, would be required to undergo an 8-hour training course based on the new protocols, a course that used the body camera footage of Leckia's arrest as a case study in what not to do. The second condition was also met. 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, the city announced that Officer Kyle Miller was no longer employed by the Rochester Police Department. The official statement cited violations of department policy related to conduct at an emergency scene and dereliction of duty. The internal affairs investigation, which had conveniently languished for months, was suddenly concluded, finding that Miller's actions were inconsistent with the training and values of the department. Leckia felt a profound sense of relief, but not celebration. A man's life had been irrevocably altered. A career had been ended. There were no real winners, but there was accountability. There was change. She decided to use a significant portion of the settlement to address the systemic issue that her case had exposed. She worked with Evelyn Reed to establish a non-profit organization called the First Responders Shield Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide legal resources and advocacy for paramedics, EMTs, and firefighters who faced retaliation, discipline, or wrongful arrest for prioritizing patient care. It would be a legal defense fund for those who found themselves in the same impossible position she had been in. The settlement was more than a check. It was a weapon for change. The policy reforms would protect first responders in Rochester for years to come. The foundation would protect them across the state and hopefully beyond. The victory wasn't just personal. It was institutional. It was a clear, legally binding message sent to every police department that might receive it. The authority to save a life supersedes the authority to write a ticket. For Leckia, that was a victory worth fighting for. The impact of Smith versus City of Rochester rippled far beyond the city limits. The body camera footage became an infamous and essential training tool, not just in Rochester, but in police academies and paramedic programs across the country. Instructors would play the clip and then pose a simple question to rooms full of recruits. At what point did the officer lose control of the situation? The answer, most would come to realize, was in the first 10 seconds, when he prioritized a traffic cone over a human being. The footage was a stark, visceral lesson in the dangers of ego and the critical importance of interagency cooperation. Leckia's First Responders Shield Foundation processed over 30 cases in its first 2 years. It defended an EMT in a rural county who was disciplined for refusing a sheriff's deputy's order to transport a critically injured patient to a local clinic instead of a faraway trauma center. It represented a firefighter in Albany who was threatened with arrest for blocking a roadway to protect his crew as they used the jaws of life at a horrific car crash. Each case was a smaller echo of Leckia's own, a clash between public safety professionals with different and sometimes conflicting priorities. The foundation provided lawyers and expert witnesses, ensuring that the paramedic or firefighter didn't have to fight alone. The most significant change, however, happened at the state level. Inspired by the public outcry from Leckia's case, a state assemblywoman from the Rochester area drafted a new piece of legislation. Dubbed the First Responder Protection Act, the bill legally codified the authority of on-duty medical personnel to direct patient care at an emergency scene without interference from law enforcement, unless a specific, indictable crime was actively in progress. It made obstructing a paramedic or EMT in the performance of their duties a felony. Leckia was invited to testify before the Legislative Committee in Albany. She didn't speak as a victim or a litigant. She spoke as a paramedic. She described the golden hour, the critical window to save a trauma patient. She explained the physiology of anaphylaxis, how seconds can mean the difference between life and death or permanent brain damage. She didn't talk about Officer Miller or the lawsuit. She talked about Robert Davis. She told the legislators about the man who was now living in a nursing home, unable to speak or walk, his family's lives shattered. All, she explained, because of a delay of just a few minutes. When we arrive on a scene, she concluded, her voice ringing with passion and authority, our only concern is the patient. This law will ensure that we can do our job without having to argue, without having to fear arrest, and without having to choose between our patient's life and an officer's order. The bill passed both houses of the New York State Legislature with overwhelming bipartisan support. The governor signed it into law in a public ceremony, with Leckia Smith standing by his side. Newspapers across the state began referring to it as Leckia's Law. Leckia went back to work. She never wanted to be an activist or a public figure. She just wanted to be a paramedic. She and Marcus were partners again, running calls in the same ambulance, on the same city streets. But things had changed. When police officers arrived at their scenes now, there was a different tenor to the interactions. There was more deference, more respect, a clearer understanding of roles. Some of the younger officers who had seen her video in the academy would approach her with a quiet look of recognition. One even came up to her after a particularly tough call and just said, "Thank you for what you did." The money from the settlement sat mostly untouched, aside from her donation to the foundation. Her life hadn't changed in material ways. The real change was internal. She had faced down a system that was designed to crush individuals, and she had won. She had learned that a single, principled stand, when amplified by truth and public support, could move mountains. It could change policies, pass laws, and redefine the very nature of a professional relationship. Her legacy wouldn't be defined by the arrest, but by its aftermath. It was in the new page of the RPD training manual. It was in the text of the state law protecting first responders. It was in the confidence of a young EMT who could now cite that law if ever challenged. The battle on Exchange Boulevard was over, but the victory would protect and empower her fellow first responders for generations. At its core, the tragic confrontation on Exchange Boulevard was born from a potent and dangerous cocktail of insecurity and institutional culture. Officer Kyle Miller, a young man vested with immense power but lacking the commensurate experience and wisdom, likely viewed the world through the rigid lens of the academy. Establish order, control the scene, demand compliance. In his mind, the ambulance blocking a lane was a nail sticking up, and his only tool was a hammer. Lakia Smith's calm, professional refusal was not seen as a medical necessity, but as a direct challenge to his authority, a crack in the fragile foundation of control he was trying to build. This perceived insubordination, filtered through the insecurity of a young officer wanting to prove his dominance, spiraled into a disastrous assertion of power where his ego became the patient, and its needs superseded the dying man on the sidewalk. In a different world, had Officer Miller been trained to see other first responders as partners rather than subordinates, he might have asked, "How can I help?" instead of demanding, "Move your vehicle." Had his department fostered a culture of collaborative public safety instead of a siloed enforcement above all mentality, this entire incident could have been avoided. For Lakia, the situation was almost impossible, but perhaps the only other tool she might have had was to immediately request a police supervisor the moment the conflict began to escalate. While it may not have prevented the arrest, it would have introduced a higher authority who might have possessed the experience to de-escalate the situation before it reached its breaking point. Her fight teaches us a crucial lesson. Knowing your rights and duties is essential, but having the courage to assert them, backed by irrefutable documentation, is what ultimately bends the arc of justice. The story of Lakia Smith is a powerful testament to the principle that authority does not equal righteousness. It is a stark reminder that a badge is a symbol of public trust, not a license for unchecked ego. True strength isn't about demanding compliance. It's about having the wisdom to recognize a higher duty, in this case, the preservation of a human life. Her journey forces us to acknowledge that the systems meant to protect us are fallible and can only be corrected when brave individuals refuse to be silenced by them. It is a victory for every person who believes that doing the right thing should never be a punishable offense. What do you think is the most effective way to prevent conflicts like this between police and other first responders in the future? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's authority was challenged for the right reasons? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please consider supporting your local first responder unions and foundations.